Good evening and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Michaela Schmidt. I am a program coordinator here at the Pulitzer Center. The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. Our mission is to champion the power of stories to make complex issues relevant and inspire action. In 2023, we supported over 300 reporting projects in collaboration with news outlets around the world. We work with classrooms and communities to extend the impact of journalism and cultivate public engagement with these issues globally. Hunter College is one of our Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium partners. Deeply rooted in global reporting that expands students' knowledge of the world, our campus partnerships spark conversations across disciplines, inspire individuals to expand their horizons, and trains the next generation of journalists. As a part of this partnership, for the last 8 years, we've awarded a fellowship to a Hunter student to pursue their own journalism project. Fellows from Hunter have reported on child refugees in Sweden, on deforestation in Sierra Leone, on mental health in Japan, on landmine clearance in Vietnam, on overfishing in Greece, on the biogas industry in Ireland, on aging population and heat waves in Singapore, and on flooding management systems in Oregon. In addition to our annual Hunter Reporting Fellowship, we are currently also accepting applications for a special call reporting fellowship focused on issues related to mental well-being in the United States. Current students and alumni from Hunter are encouraged to apply. The Pulitzer Center selects students who are curious and resourceful, and we help train them to produce amazing stories. Stories that inspire action, stories that represent diverse voices, that build communities, and that help us find solutions to the greatest challenges that face our world. This is the backbone of the Pulitzer Center's mission, and it's also the heart of the reporting that Corey and Pam are going to be sharing this evening. Students, if you're interested in applying to be Hunter's 2025 Reporting Fellow or a Mental Wellbeing Fellow, please find me in the reception after this. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about that opportunity. But tonight, we are here to hear from two of our Pulitzer Center grantees, Corey and Pam. I'm going to hand things over to Professor McCarthy to introduce them further, but first I want to introduce Professor McCarthy. Award-winning international business journalist Sissel McCarthy is a distinguished lecturer and director of the journalism program here at Hunter. She founded newsliteracymatters.com, an online platform dedicated to teaching people how to find credible information in this digital age. She's been teaching news literacy, multimedia reporting, and writing for nearly 20 years, following her career as an anchor and reporter at CNN and CNBC. So on behalf of all of us at the Pulitzer Center, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Michaela, for that warm introduction, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here for this talk on how science journalists confront their bias in their stories and themselves. We're honored to have two distinguished guest speakers, award-winning journalists Pam Weintraub and Corey Powell, here to share their insights with you tonight. I'm thrilled to see so many news literacy and journalism students here. Thank you for coming. It's clear that tonight's topics on bias, misinformation, and truth decay are all serious problems that we're up against and that we need to learn more about to be engaged news consumers. Tonight's event would not be possible without the generous support of the Roosevelt House, and I'd like to extend my gratitude to Mac Barrett, Peter Scalfani, Brianna DeAngelis, Phil, our tech guy up there, and the entire Roosevelt House team here tonight for all their help. I'd also like to give a shout out to our dedicated, amazing journalism professors for the work they do for our journalism students. We have Professor David Alm, Coralie Carlson, and Polly Leader. Can you guys give a wave? And let's give them a round of applause. We're also, of course, grateful to the Pulitzer Center, whose support made this evening possible. As Michaela mentioned, the Pulitzer Center has become the largest single source of funding for global enterprise reporting, and that's just incredible. And Hunter College is very fortunate to be part of the Pulitzer Center's Campus Consortium, which sponsors evenings like this and helps students like you break into the news industry through their international and domestic reporting fellowships. Hunter student Andrew Balaban is our 2024 reporting fellow. He's right here in the front row. Can you give a wave? He's our 8th fellow from Hunter College, and just this summer he went to Portland, Oregon to report on the city's efforts to use green infrastructure to manage stormwater and restore its floodplains. You can see his story very soon. It hasn't been published yet, but on the Pulitzer Center website. Now, for students interested in becoming our 2025 Pulitzer Fellow, we are holding an information session on November 12th, so be sure to mark that down. And you could also talk to Michaela today after this event about any questions that you have. Now, for the moment you've been waiting for, let me introduce our award-winning journalists here tonight. First, Pam Weintraub is an investigative journalist, award-winning author, and storyteller who has dedicated her career to covering science, medicine, and psychology. She's the co-founder of OpenMind, a senior editor at Aeon Plus Psyche, the author and co-author of 16 books, including the highly acclaimed Cure Unknown: Inside the Lyme Disease Epidemic. Her work has earned her numerous top awards, including the American Medical Writers Book Award, and recently she launched Tiger Tail Media, which publishes magazines like Popular Science, we've heard of that one, and then these, Inside Your Cat's Mind, as well as psychology titles like Creative Women and ADHD. Then we have Corey Powell, a veteran science writer, editor, and communicator based in Brooklyn. He served as the editor-in-chief at Discover and American Scientist magazines. He's also taught science journalism at NYU. Corey has collaborated on numerous books, podcasts, and TV shows with Bill Nye, yes, Bill Nye, the science guy, and he's currently working on a book that explores science beyond the human senses. Pam and Corey are going to discuss how they confront bias, misinformation, and truth decay in their work, and why these issues are so critical to all of us. We'll have their initial presentation, then a few questions from me to kick off the conversation. That'll last about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to you, the audience, because we want to hear your questions. After that, we will regroup and head up to the beautiful reception, courtesy of the Pulitzer Center, upstairs. And just a reminder to our journalism students who want extra credit for this event, please remember to sign in with one of our 3 professors right here. They have their clipboards ready, and you can come sign in after the event before you head upstairs. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Pam Weintraub.
Hi. Well, I think I want to start by telling you how we began our project of OpenMind. Corey and I worked together at Discover magazine more than a decade ago. It's quite a while ago, the distant past. Corey was the editor-in-chief, and I was the executive editor, and we've been fast friends ever since. And it was in the midst of the COVID epidemic here in New York City, and it was, for those of you who have been here, you know that it was horrible, and it was deeply creepy. I was here, I couldn't leave, my mother was dying, and I remember going out on like Lexington Avenue and 59th Street in the middle of the day, and I would be like the only person there. You know, it was very strange, and the whole city was empty. Conspiracy theories were everywhere, and misinformation and disinformation were rife, and it was driven by this. That we, and funded by the Science Literacy Foundation, that we decided to start OpenMind because in our search for what would be true, we felt that journalism was our true north. That was how we could find our way through all of through the truth. And as I can tell you that as a longtime medical journalist, it's not like I would just say, oh, the CDC says this, and so that must be right. I would never, after having been reported health and biomedicine in the trenches for so long, I knew that there were so many sides to every story. And so I was already beginning to see people with COVID whose symptoms were persistent being dismissed. And so we knew that there were layers and layers and layers to this. And and the grant that we then afterwards got from the Pulitzer Center for Truth Decay just went right in with our own ethic for how we would look for the nuance, not just do the easy story, but look for the nuance in all of these controversies. And one of the things that we looked at in OpenMind is the issue of bias. We did a story for OpenMind on bias that was supported by the Pulitzer Center. And just so you know, it's obvious that bias exists in everyone, but the new research shows that all of the efforts and trainings to get rid of bias and make us aware of our own bias don't do much to get rid of the bias. And so even after we've become aware of our own bias and we've worked to overcome it, we're still biased. And the new studies show that bias has to be dealt with by changing systems and changing environments. And only when that's done does the inner bias then begin to fade. So that's one thing, that's one nuanced area that we looked at. We looked at, oh, yeah, yes, I do. Wait, is it? I do, okay. Okay, thank you. The next thing we looked at that had a lot of layers to it was the issue of trans science, and you all probably know there's a lot of uproar about that. In fact, the major medical associations in this country supported the trans people in stating that science, that the science was behind them. But recently in the UK, a study came out saying that wasn't right. And in the UK, treatment has been pulled from transgender kids, and some of that is now rippled to this country, and now there's pushback against that. So these culture wars, even in the face of science, that really shows what is true, even in the face of science that is clearly supported by a majority of scientists. Even in the face of that, these culture wars keep rippling through the culture, and they keep twisting the way language is used. And so that's something else to be aware of that we covered in OpenMind, and that we covered through the grant on information decay from the Pulitzer Center. These issues of misinformation, disinformation are moving targets. They're constantly changing. One story, the story that we did just recently, is on anthropomorphism. It's on emotion in animals. And just so you know that, back, hundreds of years ago, Descartes said that animals were automatons. They had no emotion. Then up until recently, any researcher that compared animal emotion to human emotion was said to be using anthropomorphism in their approach, and they were pilloried, and they were just hounded out of the research community. Now there are a new generation of researchers that are saying animals have grief, animals have joy, animals have all kinds of feelings, and they're not saying they're human, but there's no longer a rejection of that. So that's changed again, and it just there's a whole new there are dozens of canine cognition labs now around the world that have just sprung up in the last decade or so. So every time in science, every time there's a fact and people say this is true, and you have all these people coming, you have this mainstream saying it's this way, animals can't feel, and anybody that says they can is just a flake and a quack. And then a few years later, it's all changed. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're reporting on science and you're reporting on medicine, and those issues are very much at the forefront for us. Then I wanted to mention that another thing we covered for Pulitzer was the issue of processed foods, which have been blamed. I mean, I blame them for the obesity epidemic. I thought they were horrible, and our reporters came and found that in fact there are some processed foods that are okay. That there are some processed foods that are healthier than some other foods that are not processed. So again, when you're reporting on any controversy, what happens when you're reading the paper, when you're reading the news, when you're seeing these top-line stories? I kind of call it hit-and-run journalism, where you have people that are trying to get this story in sound bites in 2 minutes, and the way that they do it is just by pitting one extreme and another extreme and making the story seem very very clear, very cut and dry, and usually there's like one expert, and then there's somebody that's like a flake or or else a stick in the mud, and a new person who knows what the truth is. And often, when you really report it, there's a more nuanced story. And I think that the key, at least when you're doing reporting in science, is to look for that underlying story. That underlying story is the real story. It's the better story. And just before I give this podium over to Corey, I wanted to talk about the misinformation that is the biggest misinformation that's hitting all of us now and going to become bigger and more burgeoning the more that time goes on, which is the misinformation in AI. Everyone's aware of it. Nobody can use ChatGPT without being hit by incredible hallucinations. If you ask ChatGPT to give you, a list of citations on any given subject, they're all going to be made up. Everybody knows that, right? That's not. I mean, I think anybody that's ever tried to do a research paper and has submitted those sources as sources knows that, right? So don't do that. But I mean, AI can also be used to spread misinformation. Bots can be used to spread misinformation far and wide through tweets. And we're all aware of how, Russian bots are coming and twisting our elections. And I think that, especially here in New York City and at Hunter College, people are pretty savvy, right? But we're all aware of deep fakes, when you've got, a picture of Jennifer Aniston and her hands are really weird, and it's not really her, and she's sitting. I mean, people here are pretty savvy, but you've got to be really careful about it. And all of these things are going to become more and more sophisticated and more nuanced. It's going to become more and more difficult to tell. And I did want to mention that the thing that's going to put AI to shame, and that is going to be the biggest bit of misinformation that's coming down the road, is really not AI, but neurotechnology. And I don't really know if it's so new that people aren't really quite aware of it yet. But after, the Human Genome Project launched the biotech revolution. After that happened, Obama supported the neurotech industry. It was supposed to launch this other neurotech revolution. And a huge amount of money was put into it. And on the one hand, this is a technology that's helping paralyzed people to walk by allowing their brains to communicate with computers and the computers to bypass their nervous systems, and suddenly they can walk. But the reason why so much funding was able to go into it was because all of these huge companies were also able to create these games, these apps that have caps that go in your head that help you sleep, that can help you calm your mood, and maybe even help people communicate with each other without talking to each other, mind to mind. All these things are coming down the road. They're being developed by the big companies, Google, Meta, and a lot of smaller companies too. The thing is about this neurotech is that it actually has access to your brain, to everything in your brain, not just to what you're typing on your computer, but actually your brain. And not only does it have access to your brain, but it inputs into your brain. It has access in and out, in and out. So there's a whole movement now amongst the scientists who are developing it to start to pass laws on this neurotechnology to sort of create a certain level of privacy and a certain level of protection for people, because this is quite dangerous. Like, if you think an AI bot on the internet can control you, what about like that? What about like a cap where something goes directly into your brain? That's much more dangerous. That's what's coming next. It's a $50 billion industry right now at the moment worldwide. So that's the next bit of misinformation, disinformation coming our way that we all should be aware of as journalists. And I'll leave with that, and Corey's up next.
Follow. So when Pam and I started OpenMind magazine, our primary funder kept kind of pressing us on our mission. And when somebody gives you money, you have to really think seriously about their questions, whether or not you agree with their questions. So he kept saying, the job of this magazine is to answer the questions like, coffee, is it good for you or is it bad for you? And I kept trying to explain to him that that was exactly what our job was not to do. In fact, that question is the problem. The idea that you can take this question that's sort of big and complex and nuanced and does not have a simple yes/no answer, and that you're forced, like a deadline reporter trying to write a clickbait story, that you're forced to write yes or no in something that will make people click on it, read it, forget about it. That is the problem. That's actually what we're fighting against. And so that was itself a sort of an interesting problem that, we're launching this magazine to fight disinformation, and we're actually talking to our primary funder to try to work through this issue of disinformation, of how you tell a story that does not have a yes or no answer to an audience that wants yes or no answers. Pam and I come from very different backgrounds. Pam has always been interested in sort of the human side of things, health, medicine, psychology, where the relevance is very easy to explain. I came from this sort of weird living in your head world. I was interested in astronomy and space and physics and these very sort of cool far out ideas that kind of people love reading about them, but they at first blush they have no real relevance to anything. So in my early job, I worked on a lot of these types of stories, and I dealt with a lot. I sort of spent a lot of time working through this cycle here. This is actually an interesting experiment in misinformation or kind of cultural bias itself. So I went and I did a Google image search of the #1 thing that comes up when you pick scientist, journalist, and conspiracy theorist. And I think we're actually making some progress. They're not. It's not a white guy in a lab coat. It's not the like the Woodward and Bernstein, the old style guy at the keyboard. There's actually some progress going on here. But anyway, the kinds of stories I was working on, I felt like I dealt a lot with the cranks. I mean, and usually they would come in the mailbox. I mean, people, these letters would show up. And they would come to me because I was the one who covered the weird stories. And people would say, gravity doesn't exist. The Earth is flat. The Earth is hollow. Einstein was wrong. You get a lot of these things. Files would show up, boxes, filing cabinets, giant cartons of rocks. Crazy stuff would show up because people were very passionate about it. And for a long time, I sort of felt like, this is interesting, but it's kind of harmless. And over time, I started to realize that it's not so harmless. That the people who feel like they have all the answers, the people who are sort of not curious about what they don't know, but are very, very aggressive about what they think they know. That when they're just talking about some crazy theory that Einstein was wrong, you kind of feel like, okay, who cares? You can go off, hang out in the cafe, say something crazy to the other person in the cafe. It doesn't matter. But what Pam and I really saw during the pandemic is that not only those types of people, but often those exact same people were the same ones who felt with absolute certainty that they knew things about COVID. They knew things about the lab leak or not lab leak. They knew things about how things spread or didn't spread. These were people who had very, very certain answers and really forced us to wrestle this question like, okay, well, who is an expert? On the one hand, like Pam was saying, if you just say, oh, well, the scientific consensus is the answer, you're kind of buying into one type of bias. But if, on the other hand, if you're opening yourself to the whole range of people with all their ideas, you kind of end up in this, in this blur of uncertainty. So I got really interested in the Dunning-Kruger effect, which some of you may have heard of. It's the sort of shorthand version of it is it's the idea that stupid people don't know they're stupid. I mean, it's a very common, it's an insult that people like to throw around a lot online. Of like, you're so stupid, you don't even know how stupid you are. That's how wrong you are. And it sent me down this weird rabbit hole that there's a guy named David Dunning who started this research. And then there are a whole group of people who said that David Dunning's research was bunk. And then, in fact, David Dunning, the expert in like how people fool themselves, had fooled himself, and all of his research was wrong. And so we started working on an article for this Pulitzer series about David Dunning, and it got harder and harder to figure out who was right and who was wrong. So finally, I'm just gonna have to interview David Dunning. And so we did an interview with David Dunning to see like the only way to actually understand the expertise in this situation is to go to the source. And it was very interesting talking to David Dunning because he himself was actually very humble about all the stuff he didn't know, and that you can see certain effects of what happens when people are overconfident, but that the big thing that he learned is that you really have to kind of stay curious about what you don't know, and so I sort of took two big lessons from this. One that I took from this interview with David Dunning, and one I'll just quickly name drop Bill Nye. So I worked with him on a bunch of different projects, and one of the things that he said that stuck with me is this thing that actually his father had told him, that everybody knows something that you don't know, that you have to stay humble that way. And what I really appreciate about working with Bill Nye, and what I really appreciated in my conversation with David Dunning, is that both these people were actually very open about what they don't know. That was one of the things that gave me confidence in them, is that when you would get to a point where you sort of feel like you're on the verge of a gotcha question, they would say, "Oh, I don't know. That's you have to ask somebody else who knows that." People who understand where they have knowledge and where they don't, those are trustworthy sources. I mean, those are trustworthy sources if you're a journalist. They're trustworthy sources if you're friends with them. That doesn't guarantee that they really know what they're talking about when they say that they do, but it means that they're a lot less likely to be feeding you BS. And those, I think, they're sort of useful life lessons in addition to being useful journalism lessons. And the question, if you buy into fake stories, why does it matter? I mean, sometimes it's obvious that if you believe QAnon and you're going to a pizzeria with a gun to shoot somebody, the problem is pretty obvious. Most people that you know believe crazy and irrational stuff at some point in their lives, where it doesn't really matter that much. The problem when you stop asking yourself questions about what you know and what you don't know is that you make yourself an easy mark. It's very easy to start to sort of stop wondering why you believe things and just sort of, and only, you cherry pick. You only look for things that confirm what you already know. You miss the big picture. And like I said, you're an easy mark. If people want to sell you something, they want to fool you with something, they want to convince you to support a certain candidate or a certain policy or invest money in something. There are all kinds of different places in your life where you're an easy mark if you're not thinking about what you know and what you don't know. I'm sort of big on sound bites, and sort of like catchphrases, because I find them personally useful. You can't go around doubting yourself all the time, but it is useful to have questions that you keep in mind in your life, in your reporting. Just always thinking, could I be wrong? Like Pam was saying, there was a consensus about, do animals have emotions? There are ideas in physics, there are ideas in psychology, there are ideas in biology. In every field, there are ideas that were sort of the conventional wisdom until somebody said, well, could that be wrong? And then really, really drilled down on that and pursued it. It's just useful life advice, and I think it's also useful advice for being in a healthy relationship. It's useful for all kinds of things to consider. I'm absolutely sure I'm right. Well, am I absolutely sure I'm right? And the flip side of that is anyone who says, I'm not biased, I'm objective, I know absolutely what's true, be very, very suspicious of those things. And it constantly surprises me, the people who say stuff like that. I was just today working on an article with editors at a very prestigious science magazine, very smart, seasoned editors, and it was about science policy and about sort of environmental chemicals and these things called PFAS, these sort of everything chemicals, and all these kind of questions about how dangerous they are. And the writer made this what I thought was kind of innocuous statement that politicians can only tell you part of the story and scientists can only tell you part of the story. Some of it is really this question of how much risk you're willing to accept. And my editor said, oh, that's not true. The politicians don't know, but the scientists absolutely know the answer of how dangerous these things are. And I was astonished because, yeah, you can measure risk, but you can't measure how much risk is tolerable and what are the alternatives, and what if what if reducing a risk by a tiny bit, increases the cost of products so much that a lot of people can't afford things, is sort of protecting the giving tiny incremental help to the wealthy worth, taking things away from the poor. these are not scientific questions. So, I think even people who are steeped in this, who think about this all the time, they sort of fall into this idea that there are absolute answers, and they stop asking themselves this question. So I guess my hope, since you all are here, and I think you all are here because you're interested in misinformation and these complexities, I hope you'll all kind of hold on to some version of that idea and that'll actually be useful to you.
Lessons for journalists and life lessons. So have a seat. I have a couple of questions for you before we get to the audience. Pam, let's start with you. I'm very interested in what you said about bias, how it is present in all of us and very, very hard to eliminate completely. As a journalist and an editor, how do you navigate this challenge?
Well, as an editor, there are certain types of bias that, for example, in our magazine or any magazine that publication I might edit that we would not tolerate. Like, we do not tolerate racism. We do not tolerate sexism or homophobia. If somebody comes to us with those biases in their stories, we just would not publish them. And there would probably be other biases that we would not entertain. There are other biases that we may publish, but we would demand transparency.
What's an example of that?
Okay, sometimes at Aeon, where I edit stories for Aeon and Psyche, long form essays, there are people that come out for and against whether people should have children, okay? I think that's a bias. And other people get very offended by these essays, okay? And they declare their bias. That is a bias. We do publish those essays where people have that.
And invite letters to the editor.
Yeah, or comments. Yeah, we publish those essays.
And are you comfortable with that?
Because we publish both sides. We publish this side and that side. We've stopped publishing a lot of the essays on not evolutionary biology, but evolutionary, yeah, where the essays where, like women want to be dominated, those essays.
These kind of psychological,
like the caveman, blah, blah. Yeah, we stopped publishing those. Those are like very biased, even when they're by scientists who study that. Like, we stopped publishing those, mostly.
Well, and a good lesson is you can use data to prove almost anything.
I mean,
right?
Even if the person has like a high position at a university.
Right.
I mean, there are just some lines. At a certain point, you just make a decision. You're just not going to cross that line and promote that point of view, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, Corey, I'm interested in what you said about finding experts for your stories. How challenging?
Not easy.
Yeah, not easy. So tell us how do you go about it, first of all, because we have a lot of journalism students here. What's your approach? And can you talk about maybe an example that was particularly difficult to nail down a true expert?
Sure. So oftentimes you don't really know until you talk to somebody. So, I mean, there are all kinds of shorthands that we use. You look at, have people published in major journals? Do they work at reputable institutions? I mean, those are things that they're not. None of them are guarantees of being a sort of a credible thinker, but they are they're good kind of gatekeeping shortcuts. That when you're just starting, especially when you're just starting to investigate a field, starting with somebody who has sort of an entrenched mainstream point of view that gives you a place to start. You may work outward from there. You may find that you end up completely disagreeing with them, but sort of knowing what the mainstream position is almost always helpful in just kind of giving you the grounding of where your story begins. Where it gets tricky is when there is no real, consensus mainstream thing. The other thing that's really tricky, and I mean, this is something you run into all the time as a journalist, is that, the outlier personalities and the outlier studies are interesting. People who say crazy stuff are interesting. The study that contradicts all the other studies is interesting. Those things generate headlines, and and people want to read them, and people want to pay for them, and people want you to assign or produce or interview those for those kinds of stories. So, this is where I think there are two rules of thumb. One is this question of could I be wrong? When you're talking about we're talking to somebody who has an outlier point of view, you want them to talk about how they would know if they're wrong and what they're looking for.
So that's a good question. Could you be wrong?
Could you be wrong? It's a great way to tell if you're looking at somebody who is curious and is trying to find a different approach versus somebody who is just a reflexive contrarian. The other thing is just transparency. If this is one person who has a totally different perspective than the rest of the field, that might be a great story, but you have to let your reader or your listener or viewer know. You have to let them know that you found this interesting because this person is an outlier. And if you're honest and transparent, then there's a tremendous range of things you can talk about. And like with some of the crazy physics stories, I did that. I just ran into this issue just recently with the story I was editing about a guy who's developed a technique. It's ultrasonic brain stimulation, which is supposed to allow medications that normally can't get across, get from the bloodstream into the brain. And so there's this idea that you could get treatments for brain tumors and treatments for all kinds of sort of neurological disorders that normally you can't treat with a pill. That with this ultrasonic treatment, you could basically open up the brain and make these things work. Sounds amazing. This guy wrote this very persuasive article about it, except it was a single source story and did not reveal that this stuff has been on a clinical trial of a total of 6 people with very ambiguous results, with a lot of money behind him, with a lot of other people who dispute it. And I thought, this is still a great story. He could be right. This could be really important. But without that transparency, without that context, you're basically lying to the reader. I mean, you're basically telling them something. You're omitting all the stuff that they need to know to understand the story. And I feel like part of it is finding the right source, but a lot of it is putting that source in context.
Right, and context is a concept that we talk a lot about in news literacy, because without context, facts can actually be misleading, which is exactly, I think, the point that you're making. Okay, Pam, back to you. I really don't get what this neurotechnology is. Like, what does that look like? I mean, is it like touching us, or?
It started with the deep brain stimulation, where they put
implants?
They actually put implants in people who have Parkinson's disease, or very severe depression, or were paralyzed, and they actually surgically, the first treatments, they actually surgically put implants in their brains, and so these are really alleviated symptoms of Parkinson's, have really helped people with this very otherwise deep depression. And you've seen in the news these paralyzed people who can now walk because these electrodes have helped their spinal cords were severed, and they've helped they've helped the rest of their nervous system communicate with each other through the computer. But
what's the downside?
But for those people, there's no downside. But the extension of that technology is they're creating all of these non-surgical products that are like caps and bracelets and electrodes that just sit on the top of your head. They don't they're not surgical, but they still read your brain waves, and they still put information in. They still go in and out. I mean, they're not surgical like the other stuff, because you're not having a devastating disease, but you can still read people's brain waves. They're still very, very powerful.
They can use that information to manipulate you, or how does that amplify bias?
Well, it allows a major company like Google or Amazon or all of these companies that are developing these technologies, and then there are a million smaller companies that have, like, I mean, there's a huge list of products. I actually wrote this story in this current issue of Popular Science that is on the newsstand now, and there are dozens of products now that have more benign, supposedly more benign uses, that like help you sleep and improve your mood, and a lot of them are used for gaming, but they put a lot of them are just gaming technology. So you wear these caps and you play these multiplayer games. The thing is, the information goes out and it goes in, and the thing is, you have information from coming into your brain. It's not just from a computer screen. It's into your brain, and it's reading your brain. So
right. I was just saying. I mean, so imagine, because we're pretty close to this. You have a game controller, or you have a thought to text translator that's a wearable device, and that seems like, it's a very cool technology. Except it's reading your brain waves. It's reading your reactions. If you see an ad, it's reading your response to that ad. If it knows how you react to different types of images, it could then feed you different images that are specifically tailored to the way your brain responds. It's one of these things that it sounds completely far-fetched until you think of the incremental ways that technology creeps into your life, where I mean, you have all kinds of.
No more poker face if they are reading your brainwaves.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, you've tailored ads on your phone. You do a Google search, and all of a sudden, a day later, all the ads on your phone are different. Sometimes I swear I'm just having a conversation, and then the ads on my phone change, and I wonder if if the microphone is on. And on the one hand, I think maybe I'm being paranoid. On the other hand, that technology
They say they
exists.
don't do that, but it is a big coincidence.
I mean, we sort of trust the laws and the regulations keep them from doing it, but it's not a technological impossibility. It's just right now it's just a social barrier to doing it.
Yeah. One more question, then we're going to get to your questions. We talk a lot about conspiracy theories, right? In our class, our students are doing a semester-long project on conspiracy theories, and I was very interested in what you called harmless conspiracy theories, like the flat Earth conspiracy theory or the moon landing hoax. And you said that these can really be called a gateway drug because they could lead to more dangerous beliefs and even real harm. What do you mean by that? And why would that happen?
Well, so yeah, I used to keep a file of the crazy mail that I got, and then when I started interviewing other scientists, I realized a lot of scientists keep files of their own crazy mail. And I think there was a time when maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when a lot of people had a sort of a naive and maybe kind of like charming view of this, like, oh, they're just like there's kind of like these cranky people out there. But especially through social media, it's become easier and easier for people to connect, and it's also been easier and easier to see the actual effects. It's hard to have such a sort of a naive and benign view that I used to.
So what's an example if someone does start out believing these inconsequential conspiracy theories?
Okay, well, so here I will confess.
Play it out.
I sometimes post answers on Quora. I don't know how many of you ever look at Quora, but I mean, Quora is a great cesspool of crazy people and bad answers. But it's also if you just sort of want to like wade out into the world of it's where serious people and bots and hoaxers and everybody kind of mingle together. So I got really interested in kind of so like the flat Earth community and the moon hoax community. And if you want to see all the crazies, Quora is a great place to see them. And what I saw sort of like personally, anecdotally, is very much the same as what you see in some of these studies that people have done about conspiracy theory belief. That if you believe in one conspiracy theory, you're much more likely to believe in a lot of the others. And it's not just because you're necessarily that personality type, but once you sort of get into this psychological rut of like, here are people with all the answers. I like these people with all the answers. I also like that their answers basically tell me that I'm smart and everybody else is dumb. It's a very seductive mindset. And once you kind of get into the mindset, it's hard to get out of it. But that's what I mean by the gateway drug. When you get into that mindset, the distance between flat Earth, moon hoax, anti-vaxxer, the distinctions are pretty fine, and the challenge is, especially like with things like the anti-vaxxers, sometimes they latch onto real things. They latch onto real things where scientists were not forthcoming about side effects or about long COVID or about some of the uncertainties. But people will they do this very aggressive cherry picking, and that again is the common thread through all these different sort of hoaxers. Is they'll find any data point that they can use to support their point of view, but they're fundamentally the people who say I'm just asking questions, in my experience, are the least curious people you'll ever encounter. Because if your answer to I'm just asking questions is not the answer they like, they immediately have no interest in that. They're only asking questions that will produce one answer.
Right. Motivated reasoning, right, to get to what they already believe. All right, let's hear from our students and everyone else in the audience who has a question. Ju, 1 second, we're going to give you a mic for our people on Zoom.
Hi, thanks for the speech. My name is Ju Hong. So I have like a lot of health issues. So like a lot of my interest is coming from the healthy articles like in the Times and everything. And then like you said about the coffee, it's like coffee is good and bad. And then I get paranoid by a lot of like situation. Like recently they talk about the white rice, you can like put it out for a long time. And so what I read recently was about chicken in the Times. It says you can't leave it outside to thaw, and then you have to like thoroughly wash the sink. And then it's like so much information. You can't do like 5 different things. So I guess my question is, how like you said about the hit and run journalism, and you talk about the common sense skepticism to how to deal with this like hit and run journalism. So I mean, I just like still, it's like very known known news outlet talks about very like specific things, and how much should I consume that information, or how do you both interpret or approach this information?
So I think that when you're reading about leaving chicken out, that's really not news, right? Because that's really a long-standing bit of advice, right? And you could, when it comes to that issue about chicken, you could go to the CDC website. I mean, I'm often very skeptical of the CDC because I have issues with them. But when it comes to leaving chicken out, I would go to the CDC website. I would. And I would see what they said about that. I would not the New York Times. I would go to the CDC website, and probably they have something about it. I think so, and maybe the FDA. I mean, seriously, like, because this is not news. There are times when I don't like the Times journalism because I feel like sometimes they report on things that I know a lot about, and I don't think they get it right. But when it comes to something like that, I think that you could go to a more ultimate source, because I don't think that's really news. But sometimes people do what Corey says in health, especially. They have 2 people that are like a complete quack, and then somebody from the ultra mainstream, and they pit them against each other. And what happens is that the story I find very often is like a nuanced story, like there are people that disagree with the mainstream person who need to be heard, but it's not that quack. It's like other people who have a more nuanced point of view, and I'm not saying the Times does this necessarily, but you see it, and they're not interviewed because it would make a less heightened story, right? It would make a less fiery story, and so that's often the problem that I have with health stories, because I cover a lot of I've covered a lot of health controversies, and I've found that a lot of the time, I think that the mainstream view needs to be modulated, but not by pitting them against that far extreme person, but by modulating them with other people doing research at other university labs that have different perspectives. And those people are not interviewed. See, that's where I come from, and I feel like that's a more difficult job of journalism that would take longer, that couldn't be done just in a day, that would take days or a week or more time, you know.
Yeah. Here, I want to sort of jump back to the original part of your question, because I think there are really kind of two key ideas here. One is how much is the actual risk, and the other is how much risk are you willing to accept? And those are not neither. You know, those are how much risk are you willing to accept is not an objective question. That's a personal question. And how much risk is there is often a very vague and ambiguous question. I mean, the advantage of like the CDC website, if you want to know how much risk is there with leaving your chicken out, that's something that's that's been studied and studied and studied, and so there actually is like if you want to know like how much risk is there, the CDC is a fairly safe place where you can go to assess what is the risk. The second part of how much risk are you willing to accept? Listen, even in my own household, food falls on the floor. One of us will eat it. One of us won't. I mean, we all make
5-second rule.
Yes, we all make these very subjective decisions. What I was saying earlier about coffee, if coffee is good or bad for you, the effect is relatively small. And so even if coffee is bad for you, you measure it against how much pleasure does it bring you, how much does caffeine improve your thought process. You weigh it against all these other things. I mean, we make those kinds of decisions all the time. You decide, am I going to jaywalk? Am I going to go outside without an umbrella? I mean, there's certain levels of risk that you weigh all the time. And I think there are common sense approaches you can bring to health risks as well. But you have to find some baseline of who you trust to sort of tell you what that level of risk is.
Anyone else? Andrew? And you're next.
Yeah. So I had a question for really either of you, but Pamela, you mentioned earlier in your presentation the research showing that it's sort of hard to combat bias, like sort of from within through education or whatnot,
right.
And that it's better to like change systems or your environment.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, like you personally, how do you go about curating your environment such that you don't fall into these, bias traps, sort of?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. Well,
Here,
he has an answer.
You stumped her.
He curates his environment. I don't know.
That is the question, and look, it's really hard. I think for me, honestly, doing events like this, I try to mix with younger generations of journalists. I have teenage kids. Honestly, that has been incredibly helpful for me, because being around people who are not quite like me and don't think quite like me is really, really helpful for me, and kind of questioning my worldview on a lot of different issues.
So that's what you mean by environment, being exposed to people who don't see the world the same way, don't have the same life experiences.
Right. And sort of intuitively, you know this. I mean, people who live in very homogenized environments tend to sort of keep one way of thinking because it's constantly reinforced. The flip side of it is, taking one of these bias tests, or going through diversity training, if any of you have ever encountered this, it's not only often unhelpful. It frequently, I mean, I've seen it have a significant backfire effect. That if you tell people they're biased, they get defensive, or if you give them anti-bias training, they find it ridiculous and they start acting out. It can be I've seen the ugliest ugliest things I've ever seen were the people were right after anti-bias training, when I saw people behaving in ways that were truly grotesque because people act out. The way you change is look, it's relatively easy for us. We're in New York City. You're constantly surrounded by a huge melting pot of people, and so you kind of forget that a lot of other people don't live in that environment where you're constantly sort of rubbing elbows with people who are not like you. Even in New York, you can very easily find your own bubble and never get out of it.
Right.
So I mean, that requires but you can do that online as well. You can sort of cultivate your online thing so that you encounter people who are not like you, but it takes work.
Yeah, and I think that, for example, prejudice against gay people, as soon as gay people started coming out in numbers and everyone realized they knew someone who was gay, suddenly that prejudice, went way, way, way down in less than a generation.
Sorry, but just representation on TV and in movies and
Ellen, it's her anniversary of coming out.
And even that's why I picked that thing. Doing a Google image search and seeing what comes up. I think that's an example of some place where I think that's probably more effective than a million anti-bias training things of Google changing their algorithm to get rid of some of the built-in bias there. I mean, that's where the AI stuff is kind of frightening, because AI is aggregating sort of the net average of all the stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
Well, I want to mention about the studies show that the passage of the gay marriage laws have reduced gay bias.
Mm-hmm.
That it went way down
right
after the passage of those laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Did you still have a question?
Not only that, but I'm also going to say, because of organizations like GLAAD or the Human Rights Campaign and the work that they do, bias has gone down because of that. But so I just have a general question. As science journalists, what do you feel is being overreported and what do you feel is being underreported?
Oh, good question.
Do you want to jump on that?
Well, I would say that it's not necessarily overreported, but people start to get fatigued. Like when climate is a huge story, right? But we would find that when we keep reporting on the climate, people start tuning out. They don't want to see it anymore. When we were doing print, every time we put climate on the cover, the sales went way down. I think that people start having fatigue over COVID. At a certain point, whenever we'd run a story on COVID on the web, nobody read it, So I don't think those stories necessarily are overreported, but I think that people just don't want to read them anymore.
What are the hot stories that really do sell well?
The stories that
what sells well?
what's
Is this going to be a big winner?
Oh,
Robots and cyborgs.
I have to see what sells well, but if that sells well. But the thing is, things that are counterintuitive, things that are edgy, things that are fun, things that really twist your brain around in surprising ways. Yeah.
Neurotechnology.
Yeah, but I mean, as a general rule, I mean, the things that are overreported are outlier events and people with crank theories. I mean, there's this guy named Avi Loeb who was the head of the astronomy department at Harvard, and he became really fixated on aliens, that an alien spacecraft flew through our solar system, and he was going to find evidence of it. Oh my God. Harvard astronomer believes in UFOs have visited our solar system. There's like a million stories about that all over the place. He's one guy with a very, very slim little story, but that kind of stuff is just like people can't resist it.
All right, we have time for one more question. Thank you.
So, as science journalists, how do you view what we would consider trusted sources that have different opinions? So like on COVID, we saw the FDA or the CDC have an opinion. We saw the health ministry in China have a different opinion. We saw health ministers in several African nations have different opinions. How do you deal with vetting different supposedly trusted sources?
Well, in terms of health, I've dealt with the CDC from way back and a lot of these government agencies, and I don't really consider them necessarily always to be the most trusted. And I don't think that most medical journalists who are really deep into the beat do, honestly, because they often are trying to control opinion. And so you just take it with a grain of salt. I mean, look what happened with the masks. Wear them, don't wear them, wear them, don't wear them. I think that you can go, that you need to find expert sources. You don't just go, the CDC says this and that's it, and that's all you ever do, and that's all you ever speak to. That's ridiculous, right?
So be skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, speak to other people. Don't. There are plenty of other people who are very expert in the world who don't work at the CDC, who are brilliant, who you should speak to.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I would add, so one of the things that we did at OpenMind is we did a whole series of what I would call context stories. So like when all this question about lab leaks was going around, the evidence was so ambiguous and it was so hard to sort of know where to trust in the sourcing. What we ended up doing is the story we ran was a historical story about the history of lab leaks, about what we know of what's actually happened and how it happened, so that people can understand what are the safety procedures, what kind of dangers have there been in the past, how are they contained, how are they reported, how transparent were people about it, so that you at least give them that knowledge, that when they hear the story, they now have something to work with to figure out whether or not to trust people. And sometimes that, I feel like, especially with, for a little magazine like us, that's the best that we can do.
Great. Well, thank you so much, audience, for your thoughtful questions tonight. And thank you, of course, to Pam and Corey for all your insights. And thank you again for coming. And let's continue this conversation upstairs. Journalism students, don't forget to sign in up here. And I'll see you upstairs.
If you have just a second to scan the QR code, we'd appreciate any of your thoughts. And yeah, food and drink are upstairs.